Hi, everyone. I'm Contessa Brewer. Donald Trump is facing new questions about exactly when he voiced opposition to the Iraq War. Today, Major Garrett interviewed Trump in South Carolina and asked him to clarify.
You were asked last night about a Howard Stern interview in 2002. In that, you sounded ambivalent about whether or not we should go. Your first public comments saying we are in danger were March of 2003, just after the combat started. How did that evolution work, and what do you say to people who say, you know, you really weren't forcefully against it before it actually started?
Well, when I did the interview with Howard, that was many, many months before the war started.
September 11th,
and you can see that was a very weak, that was the first person that ever asked me about the war, because, you know, I'm a business person, so they're not asking me about the war. Then, shortly after that, I started really studying it and looking at it. I didn't like it because you're going to ruin the balance of the Middle East, which is what happened. Now Iran is taking over the Middle East.
So you had a sense of it, but you didn't necessarily say it.
Well, you can see by the way I answered the question. I was not, and that was a long time before the war started. By the time the war started, I was totally against it. And in 2003, you see my statements, I was against it. So, look, the Iraq war, going into Iraq, was one of the worst decisions in the history of this country. We're further behind now than the day we went in.
Did you see Karl Rove's column in the Wall Street Journal today?
No, I didn't.
He said the idea that you were against the war before it started is a fabrication.
Well, Karl Rove is a man who is a very negative force. I mean, honestly, he's a loser. He was with Romney. They should have won. Karl Rove spent hundreds of millions of dollars on campaigns that were lost. Karl Rove has been a really bad negative force for the Republicans. I was against the war from the very earliest point. I was against the war before it started. And you could see that because when I was with Howard Stern, that was a long time before the war started. But Karl Rove is an enemy of mine. I mean, I don't think he's ever said anything good about me. And he's an incompetent person. The reason the Republicans are doing so badly in terms of presidential politics is the Karl Roves of the world, the establishment.
Major joins me now on the phone from South Carolina. Major, did you come out of that interview with any more clarification about when Trump actually turned against the war, when he took a stand against it?
It's hard to know, Contessa, because Trump was not writing columns at the time, and it's a plausible argument that he makes that as a businessman, he wasn't routinely being questioned about the efficacy of invading Iraq and enforcing UN Security Council resolutions. He wasn't on many people's radar screens. I mean, the first time there's a public comment from him about the war where he says it's in bad shape, and if we continue this way, it's going to get even worse, was at the Oscars. The Oscars in 2003, March of 2003. Those are the kind of venues in which Donald Trump might take a question. So it is a plausible argument that, and only he can know the answer, because he says after he talked to Howard Stern September 11th, 2002, and said, yeah, we should probably do it, he evolved internally in his own mind. He began, as he told me and told us, to study it and became less convinced it was a good idea. But there's no paper trail of that. There's no real commentary from him that we've been able to find. So if voters are really concerned about this, they're either going to have to take Donald Trump's word that he evolved within his own mind against the Iraq war, or look at the public record and say it's September 11th, 2002, he was nominally for it, and right after it started, he was against it.
Major, the other big storyline that we're seeing coming out about Trump and his campaign is that interview that the Pope gave on board the plane heading back from Mexico, where he was asked specifically about Donald Trump and Trump's stand against illegal immigration at the Mexican border and his promise to build a wall. And Pope Francis said, look, people who go around talking about building walls instead of bridges aren't Christian. Well, Trump today told a talk show host that he's honored that the Pope even brought it up. Is there any sense when he's out on the campaign trail, are his supporters asking him about this?
Not that I'm aware of, but we had a very long conversation about this as well. I asked Donald Trump today, so it's been one full day. Where do you stand with the Pope, and where does Pope Francis stand with you? He said, look, the Vatican put out a statement this morning much softer than what the Pope said or what was reported to me that he said the day before. I'm complimented that the Pope's paying attention to what I've said, but he said, Major, look, my whole point of view is about illegal immigration and enforcing strong borders, and I'm not going to be deterred from that by the Pope or anybody else. And I will tell you, yesterday, my colleagues at CBS News here in South Carolina talked to no fewer than 6 different supporters at Trump rallies. To a person, they were all generally or very specifically in support of Trump's orientation, not only to the issue of illegal immigration, but his willingness to save the Pope. I disagree with you, and I'm not going to back down. If there's one common thread in Trump's supporters, they like the idea that there hasn't been anyone yet that he will back down for.
Let me ask you about some polling that just came out today that showed that his lead is narrowing in South Carolina. The NBC News Wall Street Journal Marist poll shows Trump with 28% support, Cruz behind him at 23%. So only 5 percentage points separating them right now. Rubio, Bush, and Kasich and Carson bringing up the tail end there. When we're looking at this particular poll, does it say anything to you that this also mirrors the NBC News Wall Street Journal national poll, where for the first time in many, many months, we saw Donald Trump losing his lead in a poll to Ted Cruz? Well,
yes. There's a reason why the national poll and the South Carolina poll mirror each other. They have the same methodology. And to the pollsters' credits, they're very clear and upfront about the methodology. And the methodology here is, and I don't want to get all down in the weeds of the numbers and polling methods, but it's important because oftentimes the polling numbers that you derive from a survey are a reflection of the pool of people you ask the questions to in the first place. And in the national survey that NBC and Wall Street Journal and Marist did, and in the South Carolina survey, they weighted the electorate more heavily with very conservative Republican voters. Well, that is a constituency, broadly speaking, more inclined to support Ted Cruz. And these numbers are interesting and relevant, but with that weighting, might have been slightly tilted in Ted Cruz's favor. And the only reason I say that is because these polling numbers do not compare with anyone else's. They don't compare with ours, CBS News and New York Times this week. They don't compare with USA Today. They don't compare with Monmouth. They are what you would call a statistical outlier. I'm not saying they're wrong. They may be catching on to something because of the mix of voters here in South Carolina is proportionally more weighted toward very conservative voters. Ted Cruz would gain on Donald Trump and could close the gap considerably. We just don't know. Talking to people within the Trump campaign, they believe they're going to pull independents, they're going to pull Democrats, because it's an open primary system here in South Carolina. Right. Everyone can participate if they are so moved to participate. So the Trump campaign says weighting the pool of likely voters in a direction where a larger percentage than normal are very conservative doesn't make scientific sense. Guess what, Contessa? Come Saturday night, we'll all know who's right.
Hey, Major, great to talk to you. Thanks for taking the time to call in.
Thank you.
You can see more of Major's interview with Trump at 7 p.m. Eastern on the CBS Evening News on CBSN.